Hello, 'tis Thursday. Now, I'm going to hit you up with this stuff, which I don't think is going to mean much to you. You won't really grasp the importance of it. Which is a shame, because I think the big happenings of the next 5 years are going to be based on this sort of shit. So, you might as well get used to it, or start getting used to it now. So I'll do a wee introduction type thing. And then I feel that I'm going to be talking an awful lot more about this sort of thing in the future. The short word Q for this is bonds. Okie dokie. Right. So I'll hit us up with Cullen/Prague Cap to start with as our easing into where I am going with this. And I think the world will be going with this. Okay, so how could this work? Question mark. Good start. This is not the whole of the article, this is just the bottom bit. First, the reason why QE, and we know Cullen/Prague Cap knows his QE, has been failing due to a large degree is because monetary policy is about setting prices. Don't worry about that, I'll come back to it in future. Not in this video. When the Fed sets the Fed funds rate target, they name a price and essentially challenge the market to compete with them over that price. If you don't understand that, don't worry. The Fed could do the exact same thing at the long end of the curve. They could come out and challenge the market to try and move the 30-year bond above 1%, for instance, right? The 30-year bond at 1%. The Fed can just go, it's going to be 1%, kids. Yeah, that's what I say. And the market will move it to 1%, knowing that if the market doesn't move it to 1%, the Fed will move it to 1%. So the market will move first. The banks would lose if they went against the Fed, because the Fed has an unlimited pile of reserves at their disposal. This is how the Fed conducts monetary policy. They are a bully, and all the other children know they are a bully. A very mean bully who you just don't mess with. Okay, so we've got the power of the Fed. I'm not sure that describing them as having unlimited pile of reserves is quite clear, but we understand it at least, don't we? Slamming the 30-year bond down to something close to 0, but let's say 1%, would pancake the entire yield curve. Almost definitely yes. Not absolutely definitely yes, but almost definitely yes. If the 30-year is at 1%, the 10-year is likely to be around 0.5%. Slamming the 30-year bond down to something close to 0 would pancake the entire yield curve, to the point where borrowing for long durations didn't just become affordable, it would become a no-brainer for many businesses and households, etc. I'll come back to that. And with housing being the crux of this balance sheet recession and the most important part of the consumer balance sheet, I think it would make a substantial impact on the economy. Yes, I really think that the extra 2–2.5% in current yields would make a difference. But like Iglesias, he's talking about an article by Matt Iglesias at Slate, it was. I'm not necessarily saying that this is what the Fed should do, but the mechanics behind it aren't terribly complex. They're not terribly complex at all. They're quite understandable. So the opening thing here, which isn't quite the basis of what I intend to talk about, but it's something that you at least can think about. How do you think about that highlighted yellow bit? What we've done, the Fed has done, or a central bank has done, or your local central bank has slammed the long end of the curve down, borrowing is now dirty cheap, to the point where borrowing for long durations just becomes affordable. Doesn't just become affordable, it would become a no-brainer for many businesses and households, etc. Now, think about this now, this very day. If you could get a 25-year loan at 2%, let's say 2%. If you could get a 25-year loan at 2%, would you take it? Would that be a no-brainer for you? I'm not going to tell you how to think about it because I don't know your particular circumstances. If you're just a household, think about the household, or open your imagination if you were a small business owner, or even if you were a huge multinational corporation. Would it be a no-brainer to take that money over 25 years at 2%? And if so, why? Moving on. Now I'm going to start introducing bonds here. I might come back to this very same article, or I might just go to the IMF doc in future when talking about bonds. But this is just an introduction of bonds. In this case, government bonds. And I'll just go through one aspect of it, which is an important aspect, but hopefully in the future I'll develop many important aspects. In sludgy green on this chart for Australia and Japan are who are the non-residents of a particular country that own that particular country's bonds. For example, Australia, 3/4 of their bonds are in sludgy green. 3/4 of Australia's government bonds are owned by non-Australians. Yeah, 3/4. I'm not saying where or why it's important at the moment, just introducing concepts here. As opposed to Japan, where it's only 5% are owned by non-residents. Hopefully this will all become intelligible in the future. Going to the United Kingdom, 30% are owned by non-residents, and in the United States a very similar number, 31.6%. So just under a third for the United Kingdom and United States are owned by non-residents. France and Italy here, the sludgy green, for their unknown reason, has now turned to sludgy pink. And we can see non-residents own 60% of France's debt, 58. But getting on for 2/3, a huge swatch. And over half of Italian debt is owned by non-residents, which I didn't think was right because I thought Italy owned a lot of its own debt. Shows how wrong I can be. Anyway, it's just introducing a concept. Right. Because there's going to be a lot going on that I should talk about with bonds. And this gives us, in the euro area as a whole, that we're dropping the non-residents thing. We've gone for now banks in the euro area, because this is going to be, what I'm going to talk about is when they mess about with bonds, who is going to be affected, or whoever is owning the bonds will affect how and why they mess about with the bonds. But messing about with bonds is what they're going to do. And who owns the bonds is going to dictate what messing about is done in what area. And there are different things happening in different areas which will dictate what will happen in different areas when the central banks mess about with bonds. Okay. And for the important thing for the euro area, that 25% of euro debt is owned by euro banks. On the German one, domestic banks own less than a quarter. Non-residents own 60% of the debt. Non-residents, over half of the euro area debt, that's from individual countries, and important that a quarter is owned by the banks. The banks own an awful lot of the sovereign debt of the euro area, something I've been talking about over the last few weeks. Right, so I've done my who owns the bonds is going to be important to what the central banks do, and for the European area, why the countries will want to be voting to get the central bank involved, and why they will do that. Number 3 is the IMF working paper, which goes into a lot of this in a lot more detail. Government bonds and their investors. What are the facts and do they matter? You can read that if you like and then get ahead of me so you'll understand what I'm talking about. Otherwise, I'll be trying to explain all of this to you, and it's not going to be easy, and it's going to be thoroughly boring, maybe even for a lot of people, and there might only be a couple of people semi-asleep in the audience when I've finished. And I expect to be finished in about 2 months' time. It won't be solidly this, but I am really thinking that this is the most important thing that is going down. Okay, I'll just finish with this because it links a few things up. In my mind, you won't understand the links. Not because you're stupid, but because I haven't explained the links. This is Euro area again. I'll go back to America and the rest of the world at later times. But this chart, which is quite simple, you can see it's gone basically at the start of the crisis. The pink and the blue were about halfy, and now the pink's only 20 and the blue's 80. What we had here is cross-border assets being put into the European Central Bank to get cash. Cross-border assets would be ownership of, say, France would put in Italian-type assets to the central bank to get money. Yeah. All of those sort of assets are shifting back home. Basically, France is now not happy to own Italian debt. Italians aren't happy to own French debt, and vice versa, all over the place. And it's represented by this chart now that it's gone from 50% of banks were putting in cross-border assets to get cash, and now it's only 20%. The movement towards only holding your own sovereign assets has moved that far in this short amount of time. And that's fantastically important, because this is edging towards a place where the euro could split up. This is lessening the crisis that would be caused if the euro area split up, because you can imagine if France had put in Italian bonds and then Italy splits off, the fuss that's caused. And this is why they're doing it. They are now, banks and institutions of one country are using only their own country's assets, liabilities, because they just don't trust the rest of the countries. It's like at the start of the crisis where the credit crunch started, and Bank A wouldn't stop dealing with all the rest of the banks. It's what's happening in Europe on a countrywide scale. And if this keeps accelerating, it just will push. It won't actually push the euro apart, but it will make the euro coming apart an awful lot easier. In other words, there wouldn't be so many people, absolutely, the banks would not be demanding against it so much, knowing that their own balance sheets were under control, because they, as soon as the shit hit the fan, they would run for the protection of their own sovereign and probably get it. And that's the way they're moving their balance sheets. Right, I'll leave that there. I'm sorry it was a lot bitty, but it's just the introduction for what I think could be a long series of stuff. Oh yes, and don't forget the first question from Prag Cap. If you could get a 25-year loan for 2%, is it a no-brainer? Would you take it? What would you use it for? Why? Etc. Bye.